The drive to what I told my husband was my mother's house took 45 minutes on a normal day. I knew every turn, every landmark, every gas station with the flickering O in its sign. I had driven that road hundreds of times in my life. After school, after breakups, after my wedding when I needed my mom's cooking and her particular brand of quiet comfort. So when I reversed out of our driveway that Friday morning with a weekend bag in my trunk and kissed Kevin goodbye at the door, I wasn't even lying with much effort. I had rehearsed it so many times in my head that it felt like muscle memory. Mom's been lonely, I told him, and that part was even true. She had been lonely since my dad passed 3 years ago, rattling around in that 4-bedroom house with nothing but her garden and her church group. I wasn't lying about my mother's loneliness. I was just using it as a shield. My name is Priya. I'm 34 years old. I have been married to Kevin for 6 years, together for 9. He is a good man, steady, patient, the kind of person who fills your gas tank without being asked and remembers your work deadlines better than you do. He is not a dramatic man. He is not the type to shout or slam doors. When we fight, which is rarely, he goes quiet in the careful way of someone who has decided that measured silence is more respectful than a raised voice. I did not deserve him that weekend. I'm not sure I deserved him for the several months leading up to it either. His name was Ashwin, my ex. We had dated for almost 4 years in our mid-20s, and when we broke up, it wasn't because of cruelty or betrayal. It was because we wanted different things at different speeds. He wanted to move to another city for work. I wanted to stay rooted. We parted on a kind of mutual, exhausted tenderness that never fully resolved itself into pure friendship. We stayed in loose contact over the years, the occasional birthday message, a comment on a professional post, bumping into each other at a mutual friend's wedding 3 years after. That wedding was where things shifted, slightly, quietly, like a fault line making its first micro-movement before anyone calls it seismic. We talked for 2 hours at the reception while Kevin was occupied with his college friends at the other end of the ballroom. Ashwin had come back to the city. He was between relationships. He looked older, but in a way that suited him, and we discovered, in that particular electric way of people reconnecting across years, that the ease between us had not entirely evaporated. Nothing happened. I want to be honest about that. We exchanged numbers under the reasonable premise of catching up properly, of closing the unfinished chapter with some adult grace. The texting started gradually and innocuously. How are you settling back in? Remember that terrible restaurant on 5th we loved unironically? Did you end up finishing that certification? The kind of messages you'd send to any old friend. But something about the frequency started to shift. Then the content shifted too. Not into anything explicitly inappropriate, but into the kind of emotional territory that you instinctively know should be shared with your partner, not concealed from them. Stories about feeling stuck. Observations about what we'd imagined our lives would look like versus what they'd become. The specific intimacy of people who once knew each other's sleeping habits and family tensions and 3 a.m. fears. I never told Kevin I was back in contact with Ashwin. That was the original sin, I understand now, not the trip. The concealment started much earlier, with the first text I deleted from my phone. Ashwin mentioned, one evening in March, that he was planning a long weekend in Millhaven, a small lakeside town about 3 hours north that we had visited once together, years ago, during what turned out to be our last real holiday as a couple. He mentioned it in the nostalgic, half-joking way of someone testing the temperature of a room. Remember Millhaven? I've been thinking about going back, just to close that loop, you know. I should have let it pass. I should have sent back a breezy, non-committal response and let the conversation drift towards safer water. Instead, I said I'd been thinking about Millhaven too. Which was true, actually. I had been, in the vague, melancholy way I sometimes thought about other chapters of my life. 2 weeks later, somehow, without either of us saying it plainly, a plan had formed. I told myself an extraordinary number of things to make it feel acceptable. We were just friends now. There was nothing romantic in the intention. I needed a break. Kevin and I had been stressed and distant for months, caught in the particular grind of dual careers and a house that needed constant maintenance and a fertility journey that had been quietly draining us both for over a year. I deserve some space. Other married people had friends they travelled with. This was no different. I knew, even as I rehearsed these justifications, that I was performing them for an audience of one who remained unconvinced. The fact that I was not telling Kevin was the entire answer to every question I was pretending not to ask myself. I booked a room, a single room with 2 beds, because the framing mattered to me, because I was still trying to locate myself on the right side of a line I had already been smudging for months. I packed the weekend bag on Thursday night while Kevin was watching television downstairs, tucking in the blue dress I'd bought last summer that he hadn't seen me wear yet. Friday morning arrived, clean and ordinary. September light through the kitchen windows. Kevin in his work clothes, eating toast, asking if I wanted him to bring anything home for dinner, even though I wouldn't be there. I said no, don't worry, I'll let Mom cook for me. He smiled. He said to give her his love. He hugged me in the doorway for slightly longer than usual, with his chin resting on top of my head, and I felt something press hard and uncomfortable against my ribs that I chose to call sentimentality. I drove. The landscape opened up as the city thinned behind me. By the time I hit the highway properly, I had the windows down and the radio loud, and I was doing the thing I had perfected since childhood, moving fast enough to outrun the feeling that something was wrong. Ashwin was already at the lake house when I arrived. He had rented a small cabin rather than a hotel room, more private, he said, which I had let slide past me without examining it too hard. He had bought wine and groceries. The cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke. The lake was right there, glittering and indifferent. We were careful with each other in that first hour, politely careful, making the easy conversation of the texts come slightly harder now that we were physically present. We cooked together, pasta, nothing elaborate, and opened the wine and sat on the porch watching the light die over the water, and it was, I will admit, beautiful. There was a comfort in his company that I had been treating myself to in increments for months and now had in full, and it felt like something loosening in my chest. We talked about everything except the thing we weren't talking about, which was why we were actually there and what it meant. That first night was genuinely innocent in the physical sense. We stayed up until nearly 2 a.m. on the porch, went inside, went to our respective beds, and I lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the water and trying to decide if I felt guilty or free or both simultaneously. I think it was both. Saturday morning was golden. We took a kayak out on the lake, ate breakfast at a small diner in the village, wandered through the weekend market where someone was selling hand-thrown pottery and jars of local honey. I bought a jar of honey. I had some distant, absurd thought that I could bring it home to Kevin and it would just be a jar of honey from a farmer's market and he would put it on his toast and none of this would exist in any form he could see. It was around noon on Saturday that my phone rang. I looked at the screen and it was my mother. My stomach tilted immediately and I answered with the particular, overly casual brightness of the guilty. "Hey, Mom." Priya. Her voice was confused in a way that sharpened into something worse almost instantly. Kevin just called me. The world rearranged itself in about 3 seconds. Kevin had called my mother. He said he was checking in, just wanted to make sure you'd arrived safely because you'd mentioned the traffic was bad on the route. My mother paused. "Priya, where are you?" Kevin had called my mother to check on me. Not out of suspicion. That was the part that landed most heavily when I had space to process it later. Out of care. Out of the ordinary, unremarkable love of a husband who knew I sometimes underestimated highway traffic and wanted to make sure I was okay. And my mother, of course, had told him she hadn't seen me, hadn't spoken to me since Tuesday. Was I supposed to be there? Was everything all right? I stood in the middle of the farmer's market with a jar of honey in my hand and Ashwin 2 stalls away looking at a display of carved wooden bowls, and I felt the specific, nauseating sensation of the ground becoming liquid underfoot. "Mom," I said. "I need to call you back." I don't remember exactly what she said. Something concerned, something beginning to be frightened. I hung up, which I feel terrible about in retrospect, and I stood very still for a moment with my heart going absolutely haywire, and then I called Kevin. He answered on the second ring. "Hey." His voice was flat. Not cold, just flat. The specific flatness of someone who has received information they are still sorting. I said his name. He said, "So where are you actually?" There was, in that moment, no version of the next sentence that didn't change everything. I understood this with complete clarity. I could lie again, but the lie would have to be so elaborate, so immediate, so precisely constructed that it would require a kind of ruthlessness I apparently didn't have, because what came out of my mouth instead was something close to the truth, delivered badly and too quickly, falling over itself. I told him I was in Millhaven. I told him I was with Ashwin. I told him nothing had happened, which was technically accurate and felt completely hollow, even as I said it, because I understood by then that nothing happened was the least meaningful measure of what I had actually done. The silence that followed was not brief. When Kevin spoke again, his voice had a quality I had never heard in 9 years. Not angry, not loud, but something careful and stripped down, like he was choosing each word by hand. He said, "Come home." That was all. I turned and looked at Ashwin, who had moved closer at some point and could read from my face alone that something had collapsed. I told him I had to leave. He didn't argue. To his credit, or perhaps simply because he understood exactly what had just happened. He stepped back and let me go without making it complicated. We have not spoken since, and I suspect we both understood in that moment that the particular thing we'd been doing, whatever we'd been willing to call it, was over. The drive home was 3 hours. I don't remember most of it. I remember the honey still being in my bag. I remember pulling over once because I couldn't see the road properly and sitting on the shoulder with the hazards on until I could breathe normally again. I remember trying to rehearse what I would say and finding that every version sounded like what it was, justification layered over something that didn't actually have a defense. Kevin was in the kitchen when I got home. He had made tea, which is a thing he does when he's processing something, not coffee, which he makes routinely, but tea, which means he is doing something deliberate with the act of making a warm drink. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his hands around the mug, and he looked at me when I came in, and he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I sat across from him. I put my bag on the floor. I did not know how to begin, so I said his name and then couldn't follow it with anything useful. He spoke first. He said, "Tell me the truth, all of it." And so I did. I told him about the wedding, about the texts, about the months of conversation I'd been having that I never told him about. I told him about the deleted messages, the careful framing, the justifications I'd built myself. I told him the truth about the trip, what it was and wasn't, what I'd told myself versus what I think I actually knew. I didn't minimize the parts that were genuinely damaging. I didn't maximize the parts that had remained innocent either, because I understood by then that the physical landscape of what had or hadn't happened was not the actual issue. The actual issue was that I had, for months, chosen to maintain a secret emotional intimacy with someone I had romantic history with, in a way that I actively concealed from my husband. The actual issue was that I had used my mother, my grieving, lonely mother who trusted me, as an alibi. The actual issue was that I had packed a suitcase while Kevin ate toast downstairs and kissed him goodbye at the door and looked him in the eye. Kevin listened. He did not interrupt. This is one of his qualities that I have always valued and had evidently not extended him the same respect in return. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, long enough that I stopped trying to read his silence and just sat in it. Then he said, "I don't know what to do with this yet." He didn't say he was leaving. He didn't say we were fine. He didn't perform either crisis or forgiveness, both of which I think I might have secretly been hoping for, something dramatic to discharge the terrible pressure of the moment. Instead, he said he didn't know what to do with it yet, and he got up and rinsed his mug and went to bed. I slept in the guest room. Or I lay in the guest room, which is not the same thing. The weeks that followed were among the hardest I have known in my marriage. Kevin is not a punishing person by nature. He didn't ice me out, didn't weaponize silence, didn't bring it up repeatedly to wound me with it. But there was a distance in him that was new, a slight and deliberate space between us that hadn't been there before. And I felt it constantly, the way you feel a bruise you keep forgetting about until you move wrong. We started seeing a couples therapist, a woman named Dr. Osei, who had the particular quality of making you feel simultaneously seen and accountable in a way that I found both valuable and uncomfortable. She had us do something in our second session that I found unexpectedly devastating. She asked us each to describe, in concrete terms, what trust looked like in our relationship before this and what we thought it looked like now. Kevin described trust as the assumption that the person you loved was telling you the entire truth, not just the part they decided was safe for you to know. He said this without accusation, factually, like a man reading coordinates from a map. I understood that I had specifically violated this in the way he'd defined it. The thing I learnt about myself in those therapy sessions, and in the long, effortful conversations Kevin and I had outside of them, was something I hadn't wanted to see during the months I was convincing myself I was doing nothing wrong. I had been unhappy. Not unhappy with Kevin specifically, but unhappy in myself, in the stalled and pressured space of our fertility struggles and my career restlessness and a general low-grade grief about who I thought I'd be by this age versus who I was. I had been using Ashwin, and the fantasy of what reconnecting with him represented, as an escape valve for feelings I should have been bringing to my actual life, my actual marriage, my actual husband. Kevin, when I said this in therapy, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You could have told me you were struggling. I would have listened." And the reason that broke something open in me, the reason I had to look away and breathe through it, was that I knew he was telling the truth. He would have listened. He is the kind of person who listens. I had simply chosen not to offer him the chance, because offering him the chance would have meant being vulnerable in the direction of my real life rather than the easier, more flattering vulnerability of old history. It took us a long time to find our way back toward each other, not weeks, longer than that. There were evenings that felt hopeful and mornings that felt like we'd gone backwards overnight. There were conversations we needed to have more than once. There was a period where Kevin admitted that he kept returning to the image of me kissing him goodbye at the door and the knowledge of where I was actually going, and that this specific image troubled him more than the physical details of the trip, because it was about the deliberateness of the deception, the looking him in the eye. I understood that. I didn't argue with it. I thought about that image too. What I can tell you is that we did find our way back. Not to exactly where we were. I don't think you return to exactly where you were after something like this, and I'm not sure you should. The place we found was different, more honest, more effortful, built on conversations we'd been avoiding for years about what we each needed and feared and wanted from this marriage. We talked about the fertility treatments and what they'd been doing to both of us individually. We talked about my restlessness and what might address its actual roots rather than its symptoms. We talked about Kevin's tendency toward quiet self-containment and my tendency toward finding alternative outlets for things I should have been voicing directly. We went back to the lake, actually, about 8 months later. Not Millhaven, a different lake, somewhere without any existing story attached to it. We rented a small cabin, nothing elaborate, and cooked pasta and opened a bottle of wine and sat on a porch watching the light die over the water. It was not a gesture of erasure. It was something more honest than that, an acknowledgement that we were capable of being that version of ourselves together, that the ease and the beauty that I'd been looking for in the wrong place had actually been available to me here all along, in this person, if I had been willing to show up for it honestly. I want to be careful about how I frame what I learnt, because I think there is a version of this story that becomes a tidy moral lesson and loses the actual weight of what it cost. It cost Kevin something real, something that I cannot fully quantify and do not have the right to minimize. It cost my mother something too, when she understood fully how she'd been used, even inadvertently. It cost me, in ways that were fair costs, the comfortable self-image I'd been maintaining of myself as someone who was fundamentally honest. What I learned was not a revelation so much as a recognition of things I had already known and had been choosing not to look at. That concealment is not neutrality. That using someone's trust as cover for something you know they wouldn't sanction is a form of betrayal, even when nothing happens, by the narrowest possible definition. That the intimacy you owe your partner is not just physical but emotional. The deliberate sharing of your inner life, including the difficult, unflattering, restless parts of it. That if you are unhappy or struggling or reaching towards something that isn't working in your life, the person who should hear that first is the one you chose to build the life with. Kevin made one phone call. He made it out of care, not suspicion. Out of the ordinary love that fills a gas tank and remembers your deadlines and wants to know you got somewhere safely. It was one of the most clarifying moments of my adult life, though I would not have described it that way at the time. At the time it felt like the world ending. Later, it felt like the specific kind of devastation that is indistinguishable from necessity. I still have the jar of honey. I don't know why I kept it. It's in the back of the cabinet, empty now, cleaned and sitting there. Kevin knows it's there. We don't make it into a symbol. It isn't that kind of marriage, and it isn't that kind of story. But sometimes I see it, and I think about the farmer's market and the glittering lake, and my phone ringing in my hand, and I think about all the moments between that Friday morning and that kitchen table where I could have chosen differently. And then I go find Kevin, and I tell him something true. That's the whole of it, really. That's what I learned, not a formula, not a clean lesson with clean edges. Just tell the person you love something true. Keep doing that. Don't stop. It's harder than a secret trip to a beautiful lake. It's better too.